The temporal breach. Dr. Samira Patel stood at the observation window of the Global Science Council's quantum research facility, watching sheets of purple lightning tear across the night sky. The temporal distortions were getting worse. What had started as minor anomalies detected by their quantum sensors 6 months ago had evolved into visible rifts in space-time itself, threatening to tear reality apart. Director Patel, the latest readings from Sector 7 are ready, announced Dr. Marcus Wong, his holographic projection materializing beside her. In 2348, such technological conveniences were commonplace, but they seemed almost quaint compared to the fundamental forces they were now grappling with. "Show me," Samira commanded, her dark eyes scanning the data streams that appeared before her. The numbers confirmed her worst fears. The temporal anomalies were growing exponentially, far faster than their original models had predicted. At this rate, Earth's timeline would begin experiencing critical instabilities within months, not years as they had hoped. Behind her, the vast chamber housed humanity's most ambitious project, the chronosphere. The massive spherical structure pulsed with exotic energies, its crystalline surface refracting the emergency lights that bathed the facility. It represented humanity's first real attempt at controlled time travel, but now it might be their only hope for survival. "The council is assembled and waiting," Marcus reminded her gently. Samira nodded, squaring her shoulders. As she walked toward the conference chamber, her mind drifted to the events that had led them here. The first signs had appeared during routine quantum field measurements, inexplicable variations in the fabric of space-time itself. Initially dismissed as equipment malfunctions, the anomalies had grown until they became impossible to ignore. Time itself seemed to be unraveling, and Earth sat at the epicenter of the disturbance. The conference chamber fell silent as Samira entered. 20 of the world's leading scientists and government representatives sat around the circular table, their faces grave. Some attended via hologram from secure facilities around the globe, their projections barely distinguishable from those physically present. "Distinguished colleagues," Samira began, "the situation has deteriorated faster than our worst-case projections. The temporal rifts are no longer confined to our instruments. They're manifesting in physical reality. We've recorded over 30 instances of localized time dilation in the past week alone. Yesterday, a small village in Norway experienced 3 days, while the rest of the world lived through only 12 hours. Murmurs of concern rippled through the assembly. Admiral Rashid, the military liaison to the project, leaned forward. "What are our options, Director?" Samira gestured, and a complex holographic model appeared above the table. "The chronosphere is ready for its first full test. Our simulations suggest we can use it to track these anomalies to their source, wherever and whenever that may be. But we need to move now, before the distortions become too severe for safe operation." "The risks," began Professor Zhang from the Beijing Institute, "are considerable," Samira acknowledged. "But doing nothing guarantees catastrophe. The mathematical models are clear. These distortions will continue to expand until they tear apart the fabric of our reality." The next hour was consumed by intense debate, but in the end, the vote was unanimous. Project Chronosphere would proceed immediately. The team assembled quickly, the best temporal physicists, historical specialists, and quantum engineers humanity could offer. Dr. James Sullivan, whose breakthrough in quantum entanglement had made the project possible. Dr. Aisha Rahman, whose work on causality preservation protocols might help them navigate the dangerous waters of temporal paradox. Lieutenant Commander Nikolai Volkov, whose military training and scientific background made him the ideal security chief for such an unprecedented mission. As the chronosphere powered up, its crystal facade pulsing with increasingly bright energy, Samira addressed the assembled team. "What we attempt today goes beyond mere exploration or scientific achievement. We face a threat to the very existence of our timeline, perhaps to the nature of time itself. The source of these distortions lies somewhere in Earth's past or its future. We must find it, understand it, and if possible, prevent it." The chamber hummed with power as final preparations were made. Samira pulled on her temporal protection suit, its smart fabric automatically adjusting to her form. The protective gear was their best guess at what might shield them from the effects of temporal displacement, but like everything else about this mission, it was theoretical. Chronosphere energy levels at 90%, Marcus announced, his voice steady despite the tension. Temporal coordinates locked on the first significant anomaly signature. Team is in position. Samira looked at her assembled crew, 8 of them in total, each chosen for their unique skills and psychological resilience. They stood within the chronosphere's inner chamber, ready to become humanity's first chrononauts. Remember, she said, meeting each of their eyes in turn, we're not just exploring time. We're trying to save it. Whatever we find, whatever we face, we do it together. Initiate temporal displacement sequence. The world around them began to shimmer and distort. Through the chronosphere's crystalline walls, Samira could see reality itself beginning to bend and flex. The purple lightning outside intensified, drawn to the massive energies they were generating. Temporal displacement in 3, 2, 1. The universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a flash of blinding light and a sensation that felt like being turned inside out, the chronosphere and its crew vanished from 2348, leaving behind a world hanging by a thread, hoping their desperate gamble would pay off before time itself ran out. As they entered the temporal stream, none of them could have predicted the true nature of what they would discover, or the terrible choice they would ultimately have to make to save not just their timeline, but the very fabric of reality itself. Echoes through time. The chronosphere materialized in a vast desert landscape under a scorching sun. Sand stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional rocky outcropping. But something was wrong. The temporal readings on their instruments were going haywire. This isn't ancient Mesopotamia, Dr. Rahman announced, checking her historical verification systems. The coordinates are correct geographically, but temporally, we're much further back than intended, approximately 12,000 years before our target date. Samira frowned at the readings. The temporal anomaly they detected should have led them to the dawn of human civilization, where the first significant distortion had appeared in their sensors. Instead, they'd landed in a period long before recorded history. The anomaly's temporal signature is stronger here, Marcus reported, adjusting his instruments. Much stronger. Whatever we detected in our time, this might be its point of origin. Through the chronosphere's protective field, they could see heat waves distorting the desert air. But as they watched, the distortions began to take on an unnatural pattern, forming geometric shapes that shouldn't exist in nature. Energy readings off the scale, Lieutenant Commander Volkov warned. Something's happening. The air itself seemed to crystallize, forming transparent structures that rose from the sand like ghostly architecture. Within moments, they found themselves surrounded by the spectral outline of what appeared to be an enormous city, one that had never existed in any historical record. Temporal echoes, Dr. Sullivan breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. We're seeing residual imprints of a timeline that never happened, or hasn't happened yet. The phantom city flickered and it shifted around them, its impossible architecture defying known physics. Structures seemed to fold in on themselves. Corridors led to spaces that couldn't exist in 3 dimensions. And everywhere, there was a sense of advanced technology far beyond even their 24th century understanding. Look there. Dr. Rahman pointed to a central structure where the temporal energy seemed most concentrated. The building appeared more solid than the others, as if it had a stronger hold on reality. As they carefully moved the chronosphere closer, they began to detect patterns in the temporal distortions. They weren't random at all, but carefully controlled and directed, like the product of some vast machinery. Inside the central structure, they found what appeared to be a control room. Holographic interfaces flickered in and out of existence, showing fragments of data in an unknown script. But most striking was the massive temporal core at the center, a device that bore an unsettling resemblance to their own chronosphere. This is impossible, Samira muttered, studying the ancient yet advanced technology. This civilization, they mastered time travel long before humanity even learned to farm. But there's no trace of them in any historical record. Maybe that's because they erased themselves, Marcus suggested quietly. Look at these readings. They were conducting temporal experiments on a massive scale. The energy signatures match exactly with the distortions we detected in our time. Dr. Sullivan had managed to interface with some of the surviving data systems. These records, they're fragmentary, but they tell a story. This civilization, they called themselves the Temporalis. They discovered that time isn't just a dimension. It's a finite resource. Every time travel event, every temporal manipulation, draws from this resource, like emptying a well. And they used it all up. Dr. Rahman concluded, the horror of realization dawning on her face. The distortions we detected, the unraveling of our timeline. It's not just about paradox or causality. Time itself is running out, like a battery being drained. Before they could process this revelation, their instruments began registering a massive temporal surge. The phantom city around them started to flicker more violently, and the desert sand itself appeared to ripple like water. Multiple temporal signatures approaching. Volkov shouted, "Something's coming through." Reality twisted, and through the distortion stepped figures that defied description. Humanoid but not human, their forms shifting and changing, as if they couldn't quite settle on a single shape. They moved with purpose toward the chronosphere. Defensive positions, Volkov ordered, but Samira held up her hand. "Wait," she commanded, studying the approaching entities. "They're not hostile. They're waiting." One of the figures stepped forward, its form solidifying into something almost human. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We have waited long for you to find this place," it said. "We are what remains of those who came before. The ones who learned too late the price of temporal manipulation." "The Temporalis?" Samira asked. "One of our many names. We achieved what you now attempt, mastery over time itself. But we did not understand that time is not infinite. Each journey, each alteration, each attempt to change what was or what will be, they all draw from the same well, a well that is now nearly dry." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Their own attempts to save their timeline might be contributing to its destruction. But before they could ask more questions, their instruments began registering critical instabilities. "The temporal field is collapsing," Marcus warned. "We need to leave now." "There is much more you must know," the entity said as reality began to warp around them. "Seek us in the void between moments. But be warned, you are not the only ones who hunt through time's remaining threads." The chronosphere's emergency systems engage, yanking them back into the temporal stream just as the phantom city disappeared completely. But as they tumbled through the time stream, they caught glimpses of other vessels, other travelers moving through history with purpose and desperate speed. They weren't alone in their mission to save time itself. But were these other time travelers allies in their cause, or competitors racing to claim what little temporal energy remained? And what price would they all ultimately pay for humanity's attempt to master time itself? As the chronosphere stabilized in a new temporal coordinate, one thing was certain: their mission had just become far more complex than merely preventing a temporal disaster. They were now part of a struggle that stretched across the history of time itself, with stakes higher than anyone had imagined. The Paradox Protocol. The chronosphere rematerialized in Renaissance Italy, but the Florence that greeted them bore little resemblance to historical records. Temporal distortions had grown so severe that different time periods were beginning to bleed into one another. Through the crystal walls of their vessel, they could see Leonardo da Vinci's workshop sharing a street with a 1950s American diner, while overhead, primitive dirigibles drifted past gleaming future skyscrapers. "Timeline contamination is critical," Dr. Rahman reported, her fingers flying over the temporal monitoring systems. "The barriers between eras are breaking down completely. It's happening everywhere, Marcus added, studying the global temporal readings. The entire timeline is unraveling, past and future collapsing into a chaotic present. Samira watched as a Roman legion marched past a group of startled tourists from 2089. We need to understand what the temporalists were trying to tell us. They said to seat them in the void between moments. What could that mean? Dr. Sullivan had been quiet since their encounter with the ancient civilization, lost in complex calculations. Now he looked up, his face pale. I think I know. The temporal well they spoke of, it's not just a metaphor. Time itself exists in a kind of higher dimensional space, what we might call the time stream. But between each moment, there are infinitesimal gaps. The void between moments, Volkov repeated thoughtfully. You're saying these gaps are actual places we can visit. Theoretically, the chronosphere was designed to move through time in a linear fashion, but if we reconfigure the temporal field generators, Sullivan's voice trailed off as he began making rapid adjustments to their systems. Before they could act on this insight, their sensors detected another temporal vessel materializing nearby. Unlike their spherical craft, this one was sharp and angular, its surface gleaming like black ice. Through its transparent sections, they could see figures moving with military precision. Unknown temporal signature, Volkov reported. But the design, it's familiar somehow. The realization hit Samira like a physical blow. Because we designed it. Look at the basic configuration. It's an advanced version of the chronosphere. We're looking at our own technology, developed further by some future version of humanity. The other vessel's crew had noticed them. A communication request flashed on their screens. After a moment's hesitation, Samira accepted it. The face that appeared on their display was human, but altered in subtle ways that spoke of centuries of evolution and enhancement. Dr. Patel, the figure said, I'm Commander Ishikawa of the Temporal Preservation Force, year 4157. We've been tracking your movements through time. Temporal Preservation Force, Samira asked. An organization founded in my time to prevent the collapse of the timeline. We've been fighting a secret war across history, trying to stop various factions from depleting what remains of the temporal well, including, I'm sorry to say, your own mission. The implications were staggering. Their very attempt to save their timeline was contributing to its destruction. And they weren't alone. Other groups, other times, all fighting over the remaining temporal energy like survivors scrambling for the last drops of water in a desert. The temporalists, Samira said. You know about them. Ishikawa's expression darkened. We've studied their ruins across time. They were the first to discover the finite nature of temporal energy, but not the first to use it. That distinction belongs to another group, one that makes our current crisis seem mild in comparison. Before he could elaborate, both vessels' sensors began screaming warnings. The fabric of reality around them was starting to tear, the merged timelines becoming unstable. We need to move, Ishikawa urged. Follow us to the void. It's the only safe space left to plan our next move. Sullivan's modifications to their systems were ready just in time. As reality began to fragment around them, both vessels activated their enhanced temporal drives. Instead of moving through time, they moved between it, slipping through the microscopic gaps between moments. The void was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Here, time had no meaning. They could see the entirety of history spread out before them like a vast tapestry, but riddled with holes and fraying at the edges. Now you understand why we need to stop all temporal travel, Ishikawa said once both crews had stabilized their position. Every journey weakens the barriers between moments. If we continue, the entire structure of time will collapse. But the temporal distortions in our era, Samira protested. If we don't act, our timeline will be destroyed. Those distortions are symptoms, not the disease, Ishikawa replied. Look, he shared data from his ship's more advanced sensors. The temporal well wasn't just being depleted, it was being actively drained by something massive, something that dwarfed at both their vessels combined. There's another player in this game, Ishikawa explained grimly. One that makes both our civilizations look primitive in comparison, and they're consuming time itself as an energy source. As if in response to his words, a massive shape moved through the void, so large it defied comprehension. For a brief moment, they caught a glimpse of technology that made even the temporalists look primitive. They had found what they were looking for. But the truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. The question was no longer just about saving their timeline. It was about saving time itself from those who would consume it completely. And they were running out of time to do it. Beyond the void, the massive entity moved through the void like a leviathan swimming through dark waters. Both the chronosphere and Ishikawa's vessel seemed insignificant beside it, like plankton in the presence of a whale. Its surface rippled with impossible geometries, drinking in the very essence of time around it. "What we're seeing shouldn't exist," Dr. Sullivan whispered, his instruments struggling to analyze the enormous construct. "It's operating on dimensional principles we can't even comprehend." The void between moments shuddered as the entity passed, leaving behind areas of complete temporal emptiness, moments that would never exist again. Samira watched in horror as entire sections of history simply vanished, consumed by the creature's insatiable appetite for temporal energy. "We call them chronophages," Ishikawa explained, his voice tight with controlled fear. "They emerged from somewhere beyond our universe. We don't know if they're alive in any way we'd understand, but they feed on time itself. They're the real reason the temporal well is running dry." Dr. Raman's hands flew over her console as she analyzed the data from both vessels. The temporal distortions in our era, they're not just random effects. They're like ripples spreading out from these creatures' feeding patterns. "Correct," Ishikawa confirmed. "Your time period is experiencing the effects first because it sits at a crucial nexus point in history. But soon, the damage will spread throughout all of time. Unless..." He hesitated, and Samira felt a chill despite her thermal suit. "Unless what?" "There might be a way to stop them. But the cost..." Ishikawa shook his head. "We've run the simulations countless times. The only way to save time itself would be to create a temporal nova, an explosion of pure temporal energy so massive it would drive the chronophages back to whatever dimension they came from. And how would we generate that much temporal energy?" Volkov asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "By detonating an entire timeline," Ishikawa said quietly. "By erasing a complete branch of history from existence and releasing all its temporal energy at once." The implications hit them like a physical blow. "You're talking about sacrificing billions of lives," Samira protested. "Erasing entire civilizations from existence. To save countless more across all of time," Ishikawa countered. "The chronophages won't stop until they've consumed everything. Every moment, every life, every possibility, gone forever." Before they could process this terrible choice, their sensors detected new signatures entering the void. More temporal vessels appeared, some from humanity's various possible futures, others clearly of alien origin, all of them fleeing the growing temporal devastation. "We're not the only ones who figured this out," Ishikawa explained. "Representatives from across time and space, all trying to find a solution. Some want to sacrifice their own timelines voluntarily. Others are fighting to preserve themselves at any cost." The void was becoming crowded with refugees from across history. Through their viewports, they could see ships of every description. Elegant crystalline structures that seemed to bend light itself, massive city ships carrying the last survivors of dying timelines, even organic vessels that seemed to have grown rather than been built. A transmission cut through the chaos, broadcasting on all frequencies. The language was unlike anything they'd ever heard, but their temporal translation systems rendered it into understanding. The convergence approaches. All vessels prepare for temporal realignment. "What's happening?" Samira demanded. Ishikawa's face was grim. "Time is trying to repair itself. When too many disparate timelines gather in one place, they naturally try to merge into a single, stable reality. But in our current situation, the merger would be catastrophic, Dr. Sullivan finished. With the temporal well so depleted and the chronophages still feeding, it would be like throwing water on an oil fire. Their sensors began registering massive disturbances throughout the void. The gathered timelines were starting to pull together, drawn by forces beyond their control. Ships from different eras began to phase in and out of existence as reality struggled to reconcile their conflicting histories. "We need to make a decision," Ishikawa urged. "If we're going to attempt the temporal nova, it has to be now, before the convergence begins." Samira looked at her crew, seeing the weight of this impossible choice in their eyes. They had sought to save their timeline, only to find themselves facing a decision that would determine the fate of all timelines. Through the chronosphere's viewports, they could see the chronophages drawing closer, attracted by the concentration of temporal energy. Behind them, history itself was unraveling, moments falling into the void like stars going dark. The choice before them was impossible. Sacrifice one timeline to save all others, or risk losing everything to the chronophage's endless hunger. And even if they decided, could they live with the consequences of such a momentous decision? As if in answer to their dilemma, a new signal cut through the void, one that would change everything they thought they knew about their mission, the nature of time itself, and the true identity of the chronophages. The final battle for time itself was about to begin. The final convergence. The new signal pulsed through the void with impossible clarity. As it resonated through both vessels, the truth began to unfold in a way none of them had expected. The chronophages weren't just consuming time, they were transforming it. "Look at these patterns," Dr. Raman gasped, studying the new data. "The temporal energy isn't being destroyed, it's being evolved." The massive entities they had feared were not destroyers at all, but catalysts for something far more profound. Through their advanced sensors, they could now see that the seemingly empty zones left behind by the chronophages were actually teeming with new forms of temporal energy, operating on principles that their instruments had been unable to detect before. "They're not feeding," Samira realized. "They're upgrading time itself." Ishikawa's face showed the same dawning understanding. "All this time, we thought we were fighting against the end of everything. But we're actually witnessing a metamorphosis." The void around them began to shimmer with new energy as the convergence accelerated. But now, instead of fighting against it, the gathered vessels from across time and space started to understand their true role in this cosmic transformation. Dr. Sullivan's instruments revealed an astounding truth. The temporal well isn't running dry. It's evolving. Like a caterpillar entering its chrysalis, time itself is transforming into something new, something greater. The chronophages moved through the void with new purpose, their massive forms now clearly revealed as instruments of change rather than destruction. Each timeline they touched wasn't being erased, but elevated into a higher state of temporal existence. "This is what the temporalists discovered," Samira breathed. "They didn't erase themselves. They evolved, became something beyond time as we understand it." The signal that had revealed this truth grew stronger, and suddenly they understood its source. Through the void, a familiar form approached, one of the shifting entities they had encountered in the ancient city. But now they could see it clearly for what it was. Humanity's own future, evolved beyond the constraints of linear time. "We are what you become," the entity communicated directly into their minds. Not just humanity, but all sentient life across time and space. The convergence isn't an ending, it's a beginning. Understanding flooded through both crews. The temporal distortions they had detected weren't signs of destruction, but growing pains as reality prepared for its transformation. The universe wasn't dying, it was being reborn. Our role was never to stop this, Ishikawa realized. It was to guide it, to ensure that all timelines, all possibilities, all forms of existence could make the transition together. The chromosphere's instruments began registering changes in their own temporal field. The crystal structure of their vessel started resonating with the new energies flowing through the void. They weren't just witnessing the transformation. They were part of it. What do we do now? Volkov asked, watching as reality itself seemed to fold and unfold around them in patterns of impossible beauty. We become the bridge, Samira answered with sudden certainty. Our mission wasn't to save time. It was to help birth something new. Working together, the crews of both vessels began reconfiguring their systems. The temporal technology they had created wasn't meant to fight against the chronophages or prevent the convergence. It was meant to facilitate it, to help guide all of existence through this cosmic metamorphosis. As they worked, other vessels joined them, each contributing their unique understanding and technology to the effort. Species that had been enemies across time found common purpose in this moment of universal transformation. The void between moments began to pulse with new life. The chronophages moved through the gathered fleet like midwives attending a cosmic birth. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath as the final phase of the convergence began. In that eternal instant, all of time and space paused on the brink of transformation. Every moment that had ever been or would be existed simultaneously, connected in a web of infinite possibility. And at the center of it all, humanity stood ready to take its next great leap forward. "Ready, all vessels," Samira commanded, her voice carrying across time and space to all who had gathered for this moment. "Initiate temporal synchronization." The chronosphere's crystal structure began to sing, harmonizing with vessels from across history. The energy built to impossible levels as reality prepared for its metamorphosis. In that final moment, all of existence hung suspended between what was and what would be. Then, in a flash of ultimate understanding, time itself awakened to new possibility. The convergence wasn't an ending or a beginning. It was a transcendence. Every moment, every life, every possibility was preserved and elevated into a new state of being beyond the linear constraints of past and future. The universe had grown up. As their consciousness expanded to embrace this new reality, Samira and her crew finally understood the true nature of their journey. They hadn't failed to control time travel. They had succeeded in helping time itself evolve. The shocking truth wasn't one of failure, but of transformation beyond anything they could have imagined. And in the eternal now that followed, they began to explore what it meant to exist beyond the bounds of time itself, their mission complete, their greatest adventure just beginning.